All right, we're going to call the meeting to order. And I want to thank all of you that are here. If we hadn't started a multi-tax bill, Senate Bill 8 that has 80 pieces in it, our other senators would be here. So maybe they'll be able to make it at the tail end. So today we want to hear from Brian Ross from MoDOT, Missouri's Department of Transportation, and see what they're doing there. And to kick this off, we're going to go to WebEx, and we have Deborah Fisher that will be introducing him. Deborah?
Thank you, Senator McGinn. Our history with our speaker today, Brian Ross, goes back to 2021 when we virtually participated in an MIPRC meeting. We were so impressed with the outcome of MoDOT's economic impact study that I personally followed up with Brian to learn more. Mark Corsten and I have a history with MORPAC, an organization Brian will speak about. Between Brian and MORPAC, passenger rail in Missouri went from endangered to actively growing. Brian is MoDOT's Railroad Operations Manager. He has a wealth of experience in all forms of transportation. We're excited to introduce him to you today. Please join me in welcoming Brian Ross.
All right. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you, everybody. Before I get started, I just want to do a quick sound check. Can somebody give me a thumbs up if you can hear me?
Hear you.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you to all the legislators who are present today for inviting me, and thank you for everybody else who has joined in. I'm looking forward to explaining how our passenger rail operations in Missouri have been growing lately and what we are planning on doing to move that forward. So I believe somebody has my PowerPoint presentation that they can put on the screen.
Yes, we have a technician working on it right now.
Okay. Okay, very good. Thank you. So again, thank you for having me here today. And actually, this is a great demonstration of how technology works, because you have somebody from one state who is actually in another state. I'm in Nebraska today, assisting the FRA in a training session for the Nebraska DOT. So I'm able to present this to people in yet another state. So a great way to show how, regionally, we can all kind of work together, and technology helps make that happen. So again, my name is Brian Ross. I am the Railroad Operations Manager for MoDOT. And I'm going to be talking specifically about Missouri's passenger rail program and how it is being prepared to grow. But I want to just mention and emphasize to you that what one state does not operate in a vacuum, and that really there are regional impacts. So the benefits and improvements that are made in one state have spillover effects, and they help the state's services in neighboring states, in regional states. And I'm going to explain a little bit about the regional work that MoDOT does as well. So real briefly, actually, if you can go back to the outline slide, please. I don't typically like to read off my slides, but for this one, I just want to let you know there's 6 bullet points that I'm going to be addressing, kind of giving you an overview of the Missouri state-supported passenger rail program, and then talk about the economic impact study that was done in 2021 that Deborah had mentioned. Then we had a study done that addressed the potential for increasing business revenues for the Missouri River Runner, our state-supported route. That was just completed earlier this year in 2023. And then our FRA corridor identification program applications that we made just last month. And then a little bit about the advisory committee, MORPAC. And then looking ahead, how do we move forward both as a state and regionally? Really, the passenger rail program in Missouri has not changed or expanded in 40 years. This is really the first time since 2007 that we've seriously looked at expanding our program. Real briefly, kind of a history, we started in 1980. We average about 150 to 200,000 people riding the Missouri River Runner which is our state-supported service between Kansas City and St. Louis. And starting in 2013, we had a kind of a peak in our ridership at about 200,000. We dropped about 10%, and then from 2016 to 2018, we had steady to slowly increasing ridership. What affects ridership on a state-supported passenger route? There are micro and macro impacts. On the micro level, on-time performance will be a big factor. If a train is running on time or is struggling to meet on-time performance, that will affect ridership, which then impacts customer satisfaction. And on the macro level, what is happening in the broader national economy? Gas prices are a big factor. If you were to look at gas prices and they're running $4 to $5 a gallon, we will see an uptick in ridership. Conversely, gas prices, if they were to come back down again to $1.25, $1.50 a gallon, we would probably see ridership slide off again. So then in 2019, the Missouri River Runner is susceptible to the impacts of nature, and we had extensive flooding on the Missouri River in 2019, and we lost 6 weeks of service. So more than 10% of our trains were canceled. We lost about 10% of our ridership that year. Looking back at when those impacts happened and what times of year it was, we were probably looking at an increase of about 3 to 4% ridership is what would have been expected for 2019. And then in 2020, COVID pandemic was very impactful. The first month that the COVID pandemic started, ridership on the Missouri River Runner was reduced by 95%. Now, we were not alone in that. That happened nationwide across the rail system and across all modes. Air travel saw similar decreases. And through 2022, we're still feeling those impacts of COVID today. Ridership on the Missouri River Runner has been restored to about 85% of our pre-pandemic levels, which is normal for routes across the U.S. Most routes are running between 80 and 90% of their normal passenger levels. There are a few that have already started to exceed their pre-pandemic levels. And then, we have been making improvements to the service. We have a new equipment that we have started using, and this is where some of that regional cooperation comes into effect. Missouri in 2016 partnered with the states of Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin to jointly purchase new rail equipment for services in those states. So why did we do that? The benefits, there's multiple benefits to it. One, it gives us more control over the service. Amtrak is a national company, and they have a pool of locomotives and coaches that they can pull from. And if there are staffing difficulties or maintenance issues on locomotives nationwide, Amtrak has to make the decision of which services are going to be reduced because there's a lack of equipment. By these states owning the equipment themselves, we kind of have a bigger say in what the service level reductions would need to be if there was a reduction in any of our fleet. So in fall 2017, the Charger locomotives came into service. They are more fuel efficient. They put out less emissions and have less maintenance issues than some of the older equipment did. And starting in the spring of 2022, the first, what we call the Venture cars, it's the class of car made by Siemens out in California, those new coaches started to come into service. And the new coaches are fully AD accessible. They're brighter, they have wider aisles, they have video display boards, larger restrooms. So those are enhancing the customer experience. Those new coaches, they're slowly coming into service. The delivery of the vehicles didn't happen all at once. So those will continue throughout this year. Later this year, we expect the new business class cars to come into service. And then if everything remains on schedule, sometime in 2024, we expect to see the new cafe cars starting to come into service. And then summer of 2022, we had an enhancement to our service with what we're calling the through train. So the early morning train that departs Kansas City heading east would normally have stopped in St. Louis and turned around. Instead, that train now continues on to Chicago. And conversely, there's a morning train out of Chicago that comes to St. Louis, continues on to Kansas City. What that has done is it's a cost savings both for the state of Missouri and for the state of Illinois. But it also now allows passengers who are not stopping in St. Louis, who are continuing on to the other state, to not have to deboard a train, have a layover in St. Louis, have to reboard another train. Simply, the train pulls into St. Louis, it's there for about 5 or 10 minutes, and then it continues on. So it is a great benefit to our passengers, and we've seen probably about a 10% increase in ridership just based on the fact that we now have that through service. Okay, so what you're seeing now is in 2021, we had conducted an economic impact of the Missouri River Runner service. A little bit of history on that. So our state appropriations had remained constant for several years. We receive an appropriation from our legislature annually. The service costs a set amount of money, value X. If you take off the amount that comes in from ticket revenue, Y, you're left with the difference Z, and that difference is what the state appropriation makes up. That state appropriation had remained constant for several years, but the cost to operate the service had increased. So the result was MoDOT was getting further and further in arrears to Amtrak. So we had this study conducted. While it's not a benefit cost analysis, it helped us to reframe the conversation that we were having in Missouri. So we were able to share this information with the legislators in Missouri, and showed the numbers on the screen are 1,250 jobs supported by the passenger rail service that we support, $65 million in annual labor income, and an overall economic impact of $208 million. And the service results in more than $22 million in annual tax revenue. So at the time that this study was done, which it was released in 21, they had started the work in 2019. Our appropriation was $9.1 million from the legislature. So for every $9.1 million that was being spent in taxpayer money, $22 million was being generated on the backside. So that came out to a 2.4 to 1 return on investment. So after sharing this information with our legislators for the first time since 2015, we had an increase in our annual appropriation, and we received increases again in fiscal year 22 and in fiscal year 23. And in the budget that's being debated in the legislature right now for fiscal year 24, there is another increase for the Missouri River Runner service in there. Next slide, please. So then in 2023, we being stewards of the taxpayer money and appreciative of the assistance that the legislature was giving us, wanted to make sure that we were maximizing what we could do for the service to generate additional revenue that way, to kind of help maybe offset some of the appropriations that we were receiving. So we hired a consultant who was able to look for opportunities to increase revenues outside of another legislative appropriation. They studied what was being done in other states, in other countries, and in private industry as well. And I don't want to go through all of the check marks there, but this is their summary of findings. Their primary recommendation was that increasing ridership will have the largest positive impact on revenue. And how do we improve, or how do we increase ridership? And additional train frequencies and/or additional stops would make the train more usable and more attractive to riders. So that is something that I will explain here in a little bit again. But some of the other opportunities that we have out there are marketing and promotional initiatives and fare schemes and campaigns. Those would build on existing efforts that we've already got in place. Down towards the bottom, you can see onboard amenities, including food service. That is something that we have not looked at before, but we will be looking at. And then the first bullet point there says partnerships with educational, government institutions, sports teams, et cetera. Those are things that we are starting to look at right now. One final piece that we got from the revenue study was detailed demographic information for all of the stops on the Missouri River Runner route, plus the same information for 6 other communities that could be potential stops, so that we could, when we get to the point of looking to add more stops, we have an apples to apples comparison of the communities that we're serving now and these 6 other potential communities. Next slide, please. So the FRA then last year came out with a new program called the Corridor Identification Program. This is something that they wanted to do to identify what are new routes that could be started throughout the country, what are routes that are in existence that could be improved or enhanced. And the end result of this will be selected projects will be awarded funding to complete all of the preliminary work that needs to go into starting a new route, be it feasibility studies, be it preliminary engineering, whatever it is that needs to be done to enhance or to start a new route. The state of Missouri and MoDOT, we submitted 4 applications, and the reason we did 4 applications is because we had identified 4 specific projects in our state rail plan, which was done in 2020, 2021, as improvements that we could make. So we had already, in mind a vision of how we could expand the future of passenger rail in Missouri, and we were able to take that from the rail plan to the next step to this grant application. Next slide, please. So what are our 4 projects that we submitted? The first one being enhancements to the Missouri River Runner corridor. We are looking at adding a 3rd round trip as well as additional stops. And what that additional round trip would do is it would increase the flexibility that passengers have riding the Missouri River Runner. With 2 round trips right now, if there is a hypothetical passenger who is in Jefferson City, right in the middle of the state, and takes the train east to St. Louis, once you get to St. Louis, you only have about an hour to an hour and a half before the westbound train would have to take you back. So not a lot of time to really do anything. And conversely, the same happens for a westbound passenger going to Kansas City. If we have a 3rd round trip, we could have somebody who could take the train to St. Louis to catch a flight out of St. Louis Lambert International Airport. Somebody could take their family to the zoo for the day. They could take the family to a Cardinals game or a Royals game. Things that take longer than just an hour in the city. So that's why that one is a high priority for us. The second route that we submitted is the Hannibal extension. This is would extend the existing Chicago to Quincy Amtrak route to Hannibal, Missouri, which is in our northeast corner, in a highly dependent tourism-related industry area. And the third one, Southwest Missouri, Springfield, Missouri is Missouri's 3rd largest metropolitan area and has no rail service at all. The closest Amtrak station is over 100 miles away. So the area of the 3rd largest metro area plus the Branson tourist destination would be opened up with that. And I'm going to explain that project here in a little more detail on the next slide. But the 4th one is would be a new route from Kansas City to St. Joseph. That would open up the final corner of Missouri to service, and could potentially serve as the first leg of future service connecting Kansas City to Omaha and eventually Minneapolis. What you can see, though, is 3 of those projects would make Kansas City into a mini rail hub, which would then allow more people to travel to Kansas City and then transfer to westward trains. So again, this is some of that spillover effect. What we would be doing in Missouri if all 4 projects came into fruition would enhance rail service in Kansas City, which would have spillover effects into states like Kansas. Okay, next slide, please. You may not be able to see the map too well on the screen, but briefly, the corridor that would connect Kansas City to the southwest part of the state is unique in a few ways. One is it has two potential routes. As you can see, there's some orange lines coming south out of Kansas City. On the eastern side is a short line railroad called the Missouri North Arkansas, and on the western side is the Kansas City Southern Railroad. So what we were able to do is take data that was in our economic impact study and in the revenue study and extrapolate that out and calculate what would the benefits be for either of these routes. And all of this information was included in our application. So you can see the table there. Travel time from Springfield to Kansas City via the western route would be about 18 minutes shorter. The estimated ridership, you would have about an additional 20,000 riders. There would be an increase in the CO2 savings. We would see an increase in the number of jobs created, and the overall economic impact would be about $24 million greater on the western route versus the eastern route. And again, to kind of emphasize the regional impacts of service like this, if you can see, like I said, it may be a little difficult on this map, but the western route of the Kansas City Southern crosses the border into Kansas and goes through Pittsburgh. So Pittsburgh, Kansas could be a potential stop between Kansas City and Joplin, Springfield, and Branson. Next slide, please. So how has Missouri been able to accomplish a lot of these studies and visions that we have? And we could not do it without a group called MORPAC, the Missouri Rail Passenger Advisory Committee. They're kind of the capstone that makes all these initiatives possible. MORPAC was established by MoDOT back in the 1990s and includes MoDOT members, members of our legislature, but most importantly, it's representatives from each community that has an Amtrak stop in the state. And you can see there are Amtrak and Union Pacific and some other groups that are participants. But with those community members, they are our boots on the ground. They are in the communities. They are able to provide us with the realities that exist in their communities, so that when we are making plans for our services, we have a very good idea of what the communities need and what the impact of the trains are in those communities. And then on the flip side, they are also able to communicate directly to their residents and to their businesses what the impact of the train is on the community. So when we have a request for an increase in our budget in the legislature, they can talk to those community members who can talk to their legislators. When we needed letters of support for our corridor ID applications, those communities were able to go to the mayor, to the chambers of commerce, to the tourism bureaus, such that we had 18 or 19 letters of support for our applications. Most of those were for the enhanced Missouri River Runner service. So without having a group like MORPAC, our jobs will be very difficult at MoDOT, if not impossible. And it is a working group. We have a legislative subcommittee, we have a marketing subcommittee, and a bicycles working group. Bicycle use on the train is a very important topic for Missourians. So we have a working group trying to come up with ways to increase the capacity of bicycles on the train. And from what I understand, the Northern Flyer Alliance performs a lot of these roles that MORPAC plays. So it is again, just an invaluable tool for us, and we could not do our work without their support. Next slide, please. This map here, ignore the fact that it says Vision for High-Speed Rail in America, and instead look at it as what was viewed as high priority by the FRA and by rail specialists back in the 1990s and early 2000s, which is when this was put together. you can see, maybe you can see, I kind of drew an orange line connecting to where the Heartland Flyer extension right now is proposed to go up to Newton, Kansas. You can see the red lines, there's gaps between them. And from my conversations with Amtrak, when you have what they might call a stub service, so a service that goes from one major city north to another, but it doesn't connect up to another route, those routes it's harder for them to be successful than it is for a connecting route. So connecting between two long distance services or between two state services. So what you can see there in Kansas is that the Heartland Flyer extension begins to close that gap. It would connect up with the Southwest Chief. So what are our next steps? Is there an interest in closing the gap further? Missouri would be very welcome to having conversations with the state of Kansas about, is it important to continue to close the gap between the Missouri River Runner service and the Heartland Flyer? Is it possible for the Missouri River Runner to continue west after it arrives in Kansas City to go to perhaps Lawrence or Topeka? Those are conversations that I would welcome and we would love to have with KDOT if that is something that you would be interested in pursuing further in the future. And I didn't want to take all my time talking because I understand there's probably a lot of questions, and I am happy to answer questions. I will probably have an answer for you immediately. If not, I would be happy to get back to you if there's something specific that you needed to know. And you can see my contact information is there on the screen, and I would ask Deb or somebody else to make sure that that's shared later on. So if somebody has a follow-up after the fact, be happy to talk to you as well.
All right. Thank you, Brian. Are there any questions for Brian? Yes. Representative Seifert.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. It's really interesting. I'm a pretty frequent Amtrak rider, but I got some questions if you can maybe answer it. Been taking
Sure.
the train since right after 2000, and it's the Southwest Chief, and I take it back and forth between Topeka and Hutchinson a number of times and take it from coast to coast.
Mm-hmm.
But the last 2 years, for some reason, it seems like it continually runs late, 2 to 3 hours coming from the west.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that? Because a lot of times your connections, if you try to take the bus or something from Newton to Oklahoma City to catch that rail runner or whatever you call it, or you're going to Chicago to catch a train to DC, you can miss that. Why all of a sudden? Because it always ran almost, you could set your watch to it for 15 years. And all of a sudden, the last 2 years, it's usually an hour. Luckily, you got that check that you can go online and check your route.
Mm-hmm.
But I check it every day, even though I take it once a week to work, to see if it runs. Can you explain why it's so bad when it gets to Kansas?
There's probably a lot of things at play there. Just the fact that it's coming from so far to the west, any delays that it happens to incur along the way just start to get compounded as you get to Kansas and Kansas City. What the railroads have done the last few years is train lengths are increasing. So we see this a lot on the Missouri River Runner. There are rail sidings so that where one train can pass another. A lot of times, though, the length of the freight trains exceed the length of the sidings. So if there's two trains that are in conflict with each other, a lot of times it's only the passenger train can go into the siding. It has to wait then for the freight train to continue on. So we've seen that nationwide. So I imagine a lot of that may be in play with what's happening with the Southwest Chief.
And I'm probably pretty much understand that because a friend of mine works for BSNF, and that's what he says. The trains keep getting longer, and they're supposed to give Amtrak first choice because of all the money we put in to create a rail service. How can we fix that? Because it is real depressing when you're trying to catch a train at 1:30 in the morning and you have to sit there for 2.5 hours. And a lot of people are canceling their rides because of that. So it's daytime, it's still inconvenient, but again,
Mhm.
it seems like when I track it from LA till it gets to the middle of Colorado, when it hits western Kansas, that's when we ran into the problems. Is it because I think the tracks is?
Well, it could be the tracks.
That's what I mean.
And unlike a airline that can try to catch up, increase their time. I'm
Well,
guessing
they'll catch up and they'll end up getting to Chicago. It might be 3 hours late here, but it'll get to
it's just
Chicago in an
always
hour.
slow here.
But
Yeah,
it's when it hits Kansas because the train with the freight trains being over length, but we can't seem to get that straightened out. That's
sounds like a good job or a good question for Derek James, I think. So,
okay.
but
Y-
and this
Derek
is
James
being
would be,
recorded.
yeah.
So
Yes. So Derek is the governmental affairs director for Amtrak for the Midwest out of Chicago, and he is probably well aware. You had mentioned, that the Amtrak trains should have preference, and that there is a statute, a federal law that does give Amtrak trains preference. Um, there was a lot of back and forth on how that could be challenged, and only very recently, I think it was spring of 2022, that it was finally decided that the Surface Transportation Board is the federal agency that complaints for poor on-time performance due to freight train interference can be heard. So if there is a concern about a particular route, I know states can take action. Amtrak, being that this is a national route, would probably be Amtrak that would be the lead on that. But if the state of Kansas wanted to look at that data, Derek James would definitely be the first person to talk to you about that.
Thank you. Maybe
You're
we
welcome.
can visit.
yeah, no, and we are being recorded, so we can also send this to Derek as well.
Mhm.
Brian, towards the end of your presentation, you talked a little bit about the Heartland Flyer extension. One of the
Yes.
things that I think some of us like to see, more than just being fed by the Southwest Chief, seeing maybe a train or two coming out of Kansas City to go south. And could you speak to what you think that how that would either help the economies of scale, or would that help that whole system? Going up to Chicago, going east, to St. Louis and
Mhm.
things like that. Can you tell us about what you think that impact might be?
Sure. So I had mentioned that it would be possible for the Missouri River Runner to continue through into Kansas if Kansas and Missouri were to form a partnership to explore that route. Looking at the times for the River Runner and the fact that the Amtrak crews have an hour service limit, I believe Topeka is probably about as far as it could go without having to be recrewed. So if a River Runner train were to start in St. Louis and go all the way to Topeka, I think they would hit their hours of service limit right around the time they would be arriving in Topeka. So uh, a train would have to either be recrewed to continue on, or if the Heartland Flyer extension were to continue north and could meet in Topeka, then you would have a junction there where those services could all kind of come together.
Thank you. Other questions? Anyone?
I do have a question.
Yep. Go ahead, Deborah.
So, Brian, what happened to the businesses when the River Runner service went down to one daily train?
Yeah, so during the COVID pandemic, we experienced several months of two round trip service, one round trip service, going back to two, going back to one. A lot of that had to do with financing. A lot of it had to do with the fact that Amtrak had so many of their employees who had called in sick, and they had staffing shortages. So we see a big impact going from two round trips to one round trip. What we see is the reduction in ridership is greater than the reduction in the cost of in the cost savings that we see from having just run one train. So when we go from two round trips to one round trip, we are still using the same amount of equipment because the trains turn around. So we don't see any cost savings when it comes to, we're not using as much equipment now. There's a fuel savings, there's some staff savings, but the reduction in ridership outweighs those cost savings. And it makes it just that much more inconvenient for somebody who is taking the train for a day trip. Because right now, Herman is probably our most tourism dependent community on the River Runner route. Right now, somebody can come from the west, go to Herman, spend several hours visiting their wineries, getting lunch, going to antique shops, whatever it is they're doing, and then take the afternoon, evening train back to the west. With just one round trip, that becomes impossible. So the tourism dependent businesses in the communities along the route suffer the greatest.
All right, yes, go ahead.
So could you also, since you're talking tourism, could you talk about your bicycle tours? What effect the bicycles have?
So right now, the River Runner, when we have venture cars in service, there are the maximum capacity in each venture car is 3 bicycles. So if we had a consist of 4 passenger coaches and they were all ventures, we could hold a maximum of 12 bicycles. The Missouri River Runner, for a majority of its route, parallels the state Katy Trail, which is a state park. It's a 150 plus mile long bicycle path that runs from St. Charles to the town of Windsor, Missouri, kind of about halfway between Sedalia and Kansas City. What we are hearing from a lot of bicycle operators, from the tourism directors in these communities, is there are large groups of bicyclists, 20, 30, 40, 50 bicyclists who want to be able to start in, say, Washington, Missouri, ride all the way to Sedalia, and then take the train back. So we're looking for solutions to how we can possibly accommodate those larger groups, because these large groups, they don't just show up at the train station, on a Saturday morning and say, "Hey, we want to put 50 bikes on the train." These are excursions that are planned 6 months, 12 months, 18 months in advance, and they're people that are coming from all different parts of the country. So the benefit to being able to handle more bicycles on the train would, of course, increase our ridership, but the benefit that is going to be to these communities, because they stop and they provision themselves for what they need on the trail. They're stopping at restaurants and cafes. They're staying overnight in hotels and bed and breakfast. So that's why we formed that bicycle working group. That's something that we just started this year, because there are so many voices that were coming to Amtrak and saying, "How can we do this? How can we do this?" We needed a smaller group to get together and say, "These are our needs. What are the steps that need to be taken to address those needs?"
All right. We're going to hear from Kansas KDOT, just a brief update before we get to Mark. But does anyone have a burning question? Everybody okay? Okay. All right, Corey, why don't you come up and just kind of give us an overview of what you've been doing since our last meeting, and I know you've been getting some paperwork filed and things like that for the Heartland Flyer.
All right, thank you, Senator McGinn. Corey Davis, Director of Multimodal Transportation and Innovation for KDOT. So since we last met, we successfully submitted our application for the Corridor ID program that Brian mentioned. Had conversations with FRA and Amtrak, and we're in a very favorable position to be selected. So that's great news, and I think we'll hear back later this year. In the meantime, we're not slowing down. We've got a contract with DB Engineering to start our service development plan, or continue working on our service development plan, and continue working down the road to identify the numbers, kind of the numbers that Brian was talking about, and figure out what the impact is, make sure it's feasible, work with BNSF to understand what infrastructure improvements are needed and the like. So like I said, very brief update. We're continuing to grind on the service development plan. We have our application into FRA and waiting to hear the good news. So I'll stay in for any questions.
Questions for Corey? All right.
Thank you.
Keep the good work up. Yes, Representative Carlin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Corey, I'm sorry. I had a message and I didn't hear a thing you said, so apologize. But did you talk about, are we getting any ARPA money that could be used for enhancing our connection to wherever, Dallas or wherever we try to go?
Yeah, so the connection is from Newton to Oklahoma City, connecting through Wichita. A part of the bipartisan infrastructure law is the FRA Corridor Identification Program. What that does, it sets us up for funding in multiple stages. Right now, we're in the planning phase where we're developing a service development plan that kind of provides a roadmap for moving the service forward. After that, if successful, then you move to the environmental clearance stage where we do get our environmental clearance and do our NEPA. Following that, you have preliminary engineering, full design, and then obviously operating in the long term. So our goal is to get in the pipeline with FRA and be able to take advantage of their funding.
And what that is, get into the what?
It's the pipeline of projects. So FRA is selecting a list of projects, much like we do in at KDOT for our highway projects over the next decade, and then we'll go through each. FRA will support each project and go through the process that's required federally. So our goal right now is just to get in that pipeline to be able to access that federal funds.
And did we, if you said it, I missed it. Do we know how much we can apply for or we're looking at?
So the initial round for the planning is $500,000, which will cover the costs of the service development plan we're currently undertaking. And that's at 90% federal. Moving forward, the parameters change slightly. I believe the environmental was 80% federal, 20% state. And then the operating starts at 100% and then phases down. It goes from 100% year one and over a 5-year period phases out to where it's fully state supported in the 6th year.
For a total of?
That's what the service development plan will tell us. The last one that was completed, I believe it was $4 million a year to operate the service. The infrastructure upgrades, the latest estimate we have was $130+ million to upgrade track to be able to handle the additional passenger rail service.
Is any of this money that was announced by the governor involved in this, the short line projects? None of that would be useful for this?
Nope, that is strictly for short line improvements, and this service will be on Class 1 BNSF tracks.
So it would not be considered short line to do this kind of connection?
No, our short line railroads are primarily freight, or all freight.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Corey. And Brian, if you're still on, thank you for joining us today with that information. That was very helpful as we try to continue to grow and extend the system.
My pleasure. Thank you again for having me, and I look forward to continuing the conversations in the future.
All right, great. Well, we're going to conclude with Mark Corriston. Sorry, can't say your last name. With some final remarks. Mark.
It's on now. Hear me? Okay. Once again, thank you, Senator McGinn, for this opportunity to speak to the Passenger Rail Caucus and the public today. Northern Flyer Alliance is honored to be a supporter of these Passenger Rail Caucus lunch meetings. And we want to thank and recognize the members who are present today for coming and joining us and hearing Mr. Ross's remarks. We wouldn't be able to do this without your continuing support. As an organization, we are grateful for the relationship with Brian Ross, who we have been working with for the last couple of years in getting data and information that he shared with you today, and our association with Missouri's MORPAC Passenger Rail Committee. It's an organization that is, as he mentioned, supported by their communities, their chambers, their city councils. This is what we look forward to seeing happen in Kansas when we get a connection, because we have upwards of 60 letters of support and resolutions from the communities and chambers and county commissions across the state. The success of Missouri's passenger rail program has been an inspiration to us, and their 40-year history of state-supported rail cannot be overrated. It's a next-door asset for us. We hope that both Kansas and Missouri are going to be successful with their applications to the Federal Railroad Administration, as both states will clearly benefit. So thank you. See you.
All right. Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Deborah, and thank you all of you who have attended. We would have had a full house if we weren't doing a tax bill on the floor. So if there's any other questions to come before us, we are adjourned, and good luck with the rest of the week.